up to Rosh Pina, which is the title of tonight's talk. And it was to get you into that mood of the Galil, the calmness, the greenery, to be able to get out into the open and to walk a bit and enjoy the fresh air. But I want to go back, I want to take you back to 1882. One second, everyone can hear me? Simon, thumbs up, you can hear me? Yeah, excellent, okay. In 1882, emigration to the Promised Land resulted in, well, from 1882 to 1914, 1.5 million Jews emigrated to the Promised Land of the USA. Here you can see them arriving at Ellis Island. At the same time, only 25 to 35 immigrants arrived in Palestine, and they constituted what would become known as the first Aliyah. That's from 1882 to 1904. Only maximum of 35,000 immigrants, and of those 35,000, 50% didn't even remain. Where did they come from? They came from the Russian Empire. They came from Russia proper, from the Pale of the Settlement, from Galicia, and also from Romania as well. They were mainly religious families. The adults perhaps were at least in their 30s, and they were fleeing persecution, fleeing also the economic hardship of Eastern Europe. And when they came to Palestine, they came to a country that was backward. It was controlled by the Ottomans. And there were tensions between this new Yishuv, the first Aliyah, and the old Yishuv, which were the Jewish communities which lived in Jerusalem, Tzfat, Tiberias, and Hebron, that received their money through Chalukah, through charity, and mostly learnt in yeshivot. But in 1882, the first settlements, which were known as Moshavot, were founded in Rishon LeZion, in Petach Tikva, in Zichron, and also in Rosh Pina. In 1872, in Tzfat, Reb Elazar Rokach said the following: Chalukah, which as I mentioned is charitable distribution of money, is a curse to man and God. The salvation of Israel will be revealed between the furrows of the fields, and redemption will arise from the furrow. And in 1878, Rokach led 10 families down from Tzfat to settle in the valley at the bottom of Mount Canaan. It's to settle in Gay Oni, which was a play on the Arab town, I don't know how to pronounce it, but Jauni. Reb Moshe Shulman wrote in his memoirs, the Jews of Tzfat, the journey from Tzfat to Gay Oni took 2 hours, and at the time, bandits lay in wait. They dwelled in, the people that went to live there lived in ramshackle chushot, that was small shacks they found on the land that they purchased. The first year was a drought, and the fields didn't produce crops, and the few animals they had died. The settlers sent letters requesting help, but there was no response. The isolated settlement started to crumble, and in 1880 they returned to Tzfat to live under the Chalukah. This was the first attempt to settle what would become known as Rosh Pina. In 1882, Moshe David Shub came on a pilot mission, not with Nefesh B'Nefesh, but he came on a pilot mission from Romania, looking for land for a community from Mionesti to settle. And he found the same area, the area of Gay Oni, and in September of 1882, he returned with 25 families that arrived by boat to Beirut, made their way to Gay Oni through Tzfat, and they renamed the settlement Rosh Pina. Reb Hirsch Bando, in an essay which was published about 12 years after the first settlement, wrote as follows: and when people came there with their wives and children in September of 1882, their money almost immediately ran out, and various diseases afflicted upon these people. In almost every house, The members of the household lay on their deathbeds groaning in pain. The children were faint with hunger, and there was nothing with which to revive them. And there was no end to the sight of boils on their skin and flesh, which covered them from head to toe. So things were very, very hard. The settlers of the first Aliyah, they built 11 houses, and they also requested help from their Arab neighbors. In the next year, they actually managed to celebrate the first wedding in the Moshava of Rosh Pina, when Malka, the daughter of Velvel Blum, who was one of those first 25 families to come, she married Fisher Rubenstein. And they invited the Arab laborers that were building their houses. And one of them had the bright idea to encourage the Jewish settlers to indulge in something that was very common in the Arab communities, that is to take his pistol and fire it in the air. Unfortunately, the bullet, as we know happens, the bullet went up in the air, came down and killed an Arab laborer. And the settlers were very fearful of what the Arabs would do. Luckily for them, the local Bedouin sheikh, Haj Ali Jarbut, he took all the settlers into his home, and he gave them his protection. And when the Arabs near Tzfat came looking for the perpetrators of the murder, he negotiated that the settlers would pay a sulha, which is a repentance payment. By the way, this is still practiced in Arab communities, certainly Arab communities in Israel to this day. The sulha was paid to the Arab family, and the Jewish settlers were left alone. This, of course, left them with no money. The crops failed, and they actually gave consideration to returning to Romania. But Esther Bandel, who was the wife of Reb Hirsch Bandel, who I mentioned previously, she went into the synagogue, she took a Sefer Torah, which was very unusual for a woman to do that, and she made a public vow that she would not leave Rosh Pina, despite the fact that apparently she was one of the main grumblers about how conditions were terrible. There were water shortages, and people began to mortgage their land as a way of raising some money. And eventually, the situation became so bad that the people were left with no option but to go to Baron Edmund de Rothschild and request his help in helping their ailing community of Rosh Pina. Rothschild agreed to take over the settlement, to basically buy up all the land, and the settlers would stop being landowners. They would get a paid salary each month. And they made various attempts to cultivate crops. They firstly tried to grow Rothschild's favorite crop, which was grapes for wine. That failed. They attempted to build a flour mill. That failed. They attempted to grow mulberries, which were used for silkworm, for making silk, and that didn't work. There were attempts to manufacture perfume, and none of this worked. And it wasn't helped by the fact that the Baron's administrators, as they were in many of the Moshavot, were Europeans. They were corrupt, and they were very, very disinterested in the well-being of the local workers. On the bottom picture, you see Bet Pkidut, which is still there in Rosh Pina. And every month, the former landowners and now workers in the Moshava, they would go to the building, they would go up their stairs. The stairs were called the stairs of the Bochim, because they would get their wages, and then they would cry, basically, because they had no land, they had these meager wages, and it was a long way, perhaps, from their dreams when they originally emigrated to Palestine in 1882. In 1900, the administration of the Moshavot was transferred to the Jewish Colonization Association, or ICA, and from that point, rather than being administrated directly by Rothschild's appointed henchmen, and from that point, things changed, although things were still very, very hard for the settlers in Rosh Pina. And you can still visit Bet HaPekidot Hayom, and it's today, and it's the major historical museum in Rosh Pina. Okay, schooling. So schooling was revolutionary. Schooling was pioneered by two teachers. There were others, by Simcha Vilkomitz, who you can see in the top picture, and also by Yitzhak Epstein. And they taught a curriculum, and they took the revolutionary step of actually teaching in Hebrew. Students, who you can see in the bottom picture, would work 4 hours, they would have lunch, and then they would work another 4 hours. So this was very much perhaps what we were used to when we grew up in England, an 8-hour school day. And after they'd finished in school, they had to work in the vegetable garden. There were tiulim once a month. And what distinguished the schooling was the famous Galilean hard bet. So you know, we have bet and we have vet and we have ber and ver. So Vilkomitz considered that the proper way to say bet was the hard bet, and he even wrote to Eliezer ben Yehuda and tried to convince him that this was the right way to say the bet. But this became very well known and practiced outside, not just in Rosh Pina, but through the Galil, that people would speak with this distinctive Galilean hard bet dialogue. The house of Simcha Vilkomitz is still there, and today it is an art gallery. The people suffered, as I mentioned, from many diseases, one of which was malaria. Godot Mayer was born in 1894 in Lithuania. He served as a medical officer with the Jewish Legion in World War I. After the war had finished, he returned to Palestine. He worked in manual labor, draining the swamps, which was known as a way that perhaps could eradicate malaria. It didn't do that completely. And he completed his medical studies, moved to Rosh Pina, and he established a center for malarial research. And one of the research projects he did was to inject his wife with malaria, because it was thought there was a link, his pregnant wife, it was thought there was a link between malaria and miscarriage. Bizarre, frightening. Fortunately, his wife didn't miscarry. You can visit the Godot Mayer's house, and you can see various exhibits today, including cages with sleeves, which his children would use. They put their hands down the sleeves. The cages would contain mosquitoes, and they would deliberately infect themselves with malaria and see whether they could develop resistance. You can also see formaldehyde preserved rats and bats. I haven't been there, okay? It's a museum. And opposite there, you can see it's not open, but you can see it's a little bit dilapidated, but you can see a building which served as the first hotel in Rosh Pina. Yes, there was even a simmer in the 1890s. This was the Alter Schwarz Hotel, and it had some distinguished guests. I think Trumpeldor stayed there, and also Rav Avraham Yitzchak Kook, the chief rabbi. He stayed there in 1913 when he came out of Jerusalem, and he conducted a tour of all the Moshavot together with the Gadol Ador, Rav Yosef Chaim Zunefeld, and other distinguished rabbis. And they really went out and they met with the Amcha. And there are a couple of famous stories regarding Rav Kook's visit. First of all, he had a run-in with Vilkomitz regarding the disgraceful thing that Vilkomitz was doing, which was he was actually teaching in Hebrew, which obviously was not very acceptable to Rav Kook, who was a Yiddish speaker, but Vilkomitz wasn't having any of that. And also, there were various discussions between the rabbis on the ramifications of Shemitah. And I'm not sure whether it was actually in Rosh Pina, but it was during the visit to the Moshavot that Rav Kook came up with his pasak to allow heter mechira, to allow chametz, leavened bread, or leavened material to be sold during Pesach, simply because the people in Rosh Pina and the other Moshavot were so poor that it was clear that there was absolutely no way they could keep Shemitah and leave their fields fallow for a year. There was no way they could do that. They would die of starvation. And for Pikuach Nefesh, Rav Kook instituted Heter Mechira that we still have to this day. Okay, finally, some other attractions that you can see in Rosh Pina. It's worth visiting the cemetery. You can see the grave there of Wilkemitz. There's also, you can visit the grave of Shlomo ben Yosef, and he was the first member of the Etzel that was hung by the British well before the Second World War, I think in 1938, and we'll talk more about him next week. You can visit the rather beautiful Gana Baron. A Baron is after Rothschild. On the very top of the hill, there is an extremely nice lookout with a rather tragic story. It was built by Chezi Segev, who, if you go up there, you can often find him there, and he'll tell you the story of the lookout. And basically, it's a memorial that was built in memory of his son Nimrod, who was in a tank and was killed in the Second Lebanon War. A very interesting guy to speak to, and there's a beautiful lookout over the valley and out to the Golan Heights. If you visit Rosh Pina, you can also visit the art galleries, and there's very, very nice coffee houses, restaurants, many of which are kosher, and you can enjoy, as I mentioned at the beginning, great air and the chilled atmosphere of the